There is nothing impossible to him who will try. Those words were not spoken by a god. They were not carved into a temple wall by priests. They came from the mouth of a young man, barely 20 years old, standing at the edge of the known world, looking outward, not with fear, but with hunger. Alexander of Macedon, a name that became a title, a life that became a legend, a philosophy that still echoes in the minds of every man who has ever dared to reach beyond what was given to him. But history has been kind to Alexander in some ways and cruel in others. We remember the conquests, the battles, the empire that stretched from Greece to the borders of India. We remember the marble statues and the golden armor. What we forget, what most men never learn, is the philosophy behind the man, the code he lived by, the mental architecture of a king who was never content, never satisfied, never willing to accept the ceiling the world placed above him. This is not a story about a conqueror. This is a story about a mindset, and that mindset will change how you see yourself, your ambitions, and the limitations you have quietly accepted as permanent. Alexander was born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of Macedon. His father was Philip II, a brilliant military strategist who had already transformed a weak, fractured kingdom into one of the most powerful forces in Greece. His mother was Olympias, a fierce, almost mythological woman who whispered to Alexander from his earliest years that the gods themselves had chosen him. Most children are shaped by what their parents say. Alexander was shaped by what his parents believed about him, and what they believed was extraordinary. Olympias told him he was descended from Achilles on her side, and from Hercules on his father's side. She told him he was not merely royal. She told him he was divine. Now, most mothers tell their sons they are special, but Olympias raised a boy who actually believed it in his bones. Not with arrogance, with certainty. There is a difference. Arrogance says, "I am better than you." Certainty says, "I was built for something greater, and nothing will stop me from reaching it." That distinction would define Alexander's entire life. But here is what most people do not know. When Alexander was a boy, a horse came to Macedon that no man could ride. His name was Bucephalus, a massive, black, terrifying animal that threw every rider who dared mount him, including the finest horsemen in Philip's court. The horse was wild, uncontrollable, deemed useless. Philip was ready to send the animal away. 13-year-old Alexander stepped forward. The court laughed. Soldiers exchanged glances. Even Philip looked at his son with a mixture of amusement and concern. But Alexander had noticed something no one else had. He had watched the horse carefully. Bucephalus was not wild. He was afraid. He was spooked by his own shadow. Every time a rider mounted him, the horse saw his shadow shifting beneath him and panicked. Alexander turned the horse toward the sun, so the shadow fell behind him, out of sight. He stroked the animal gently, spoke to him quietly, and then mounted him without force. Bucephalus stood still. The court fell silent. Philip wept. He looked at his son and said, words recorded by Plutarch centuries later, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedon is too small for you." That moment, a 13-year-old boy seeing what trained horsemen could not see, reveals everything about Alexander's mind. He did not overpower obstacles. He understood them. He studied what others dismissed. He looked for the angle no one else had considered. A king's mindset does not begin with conquest. It begins with observation. Philip did not leave Alexander's education to chance. He sought the greatest mind in the ancient world to shape his son's thinking. In 343 BC, he summoned Aristotle. Not a soldier, not a general, a philosopher. Think about that. The most powerful king in Greece, preparing his son for war and empire, chose a philosopher to be his greatest teacher, because Philip understood something that most men still do not. The battlefield begins in the mind. Aristotle taught Alexander medicine, philosophy, rhetoric, science, and literature. He taught him how to reason, how to question, and how to see the world not as it appeared, but as it actually was. He gave Alexander a love of Homer, and Alexander carried a copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle himself, with him on every campaign. He slept with it beneath his pillow alongside a dagger. Two things: knowledge and readiness, wisdom and action, philosophy and power. This is not a coincidence. This is a creed. Alexander never saw learning as something separate from strength. He saw it as the source of strength. He could debate philosophy with scholars in the morning and ride into battle in the afternoon. He could quote Homer by the campfire and design a military siege by dawn. The men who build the most are never only thinkers or only fighters. They are both. Now, here is a story that almost never gets told. In the early years of his campaigns, long before he reached Persia and Egypt and India, Alexander and his army passed through some of the most brutal terrain in the ancient world. In the Hindu Kush mountains, temperatures dropped so severely that men lost fingers, toes, and entire limbs to frostbite. The passes were narrow, the altitude suffocating, the wind relentless. His men began to collapse. Morale fractured. Some soldiers sat down in the snow and refused to move, choosing to die rather than push forward. Alexander did not order them forward. He dismounted his horse. He walked. He walked through the snow with his men, on foot, in the same conditions, refusing the warmth of his cloak when his soldiers had none. He moved from man to man, personally pulling them to their feet, speaking directly into their faces, calling them by name. His officers begged him to ride. He was the king. He could not risk himself on foot in a snowstorm. He refused. He told them, according to those who recorded his words, that he would not ask any man to endure what he himself would not endure first. That army crossed the Hindu Kush, and they did it not because Alexander commanded them. They did it because they loved him, because a king had chosen to suffer with them rather than above them. That is the first law of a king's mindset. You do not lead from comfort. You lead from the front. When Alexander was 20 years old, Philip was assassinated, and the throne of Macedon fell to him. His enemies immediately declared his kingdom finished. Rival city-states began to celebrate. Barbarian tribes on the borders began to mobilize. Even some of his father's generals whispered that the boy king would collapse within months. They did not understand what they were facing. Within 2 years, Alexander had crushed every domestic rebellion, destroyed the city of Thebes so completely that Greece fell silent with shock, and then turned his gaze eastward, toward Persia, toward an empire that dwarfed his own kingdom the way the ocean dwarfs a river. The Persian Empire at that time was the largest the world had ever known. It stretched across 3 continents and commanded armies of hundreds of thousands. Its king, Darius III, sat upon a throne of unimaginable wealth and power. Alexander crossed into Persian territory with roughly 40,000 men. He was not reckless, he was precise. At the Battle of Granicus, his first major engagement in Persian territory, his generals advised caution. The river crossing was dangerous. The Persian cavalry was positioned on the opposite bank, waiting. The ground was poor. The timing was wrong. Every military calculation suggested they should wait. Alexander charged across the river, not because he was foolish, because he understood that hesitation communicates weakness, that an enemy who sees you pause begins to believe they can break you, and an army that sees its own king pause begins to doubt the mission. Speed was not just military strategy for Alexander. Speed was a psychological weapon. Strike before doubt can set in. Move before fear can organize. Attack before the enemy can imagine you capable of what you are about to do. And during that charge, when a Persian commander raised his sword to split Alexander's skull from behind, it was his general Cletus who parried the blow, saving his life. Alexander would later kill Cletus in a drunken rage years later, a moment of darkness he carried with grief for the rest of his life. He isolated himself for days, refusing to eat, refusing to leave his tent, weeping over the body of the man who had once saved him. This, too, is part of his philosophy. He was not a perfect man. He was a real one, a man who carried both greatness and flaws, and who understood that power without self-awareness becomes destruction. In Egypt, the priests of the oracle at Siwa greeted Alexander as the son of Amun, their god. They declared him divine. He accepted it, not because he had lost his mind, because he understood something fundamental about how power works. People need a story. They need to believe that the one who leads them is connected to something greater than ordinary life. Give people a compelling story about who you are, and they will follow you into places logic alone would never take them. He founded Alexandria on the Egyptian coast, designing the city himself, laying out its streets in his mind before a single stone was placed. He did not have chalk to mark the plans on the ground, so he used barley grain to trace the city's outline across the sand. Then birds came and ate the grain. His advisors called it a bad omen, a sign of failure. Alexander called it a sign of abundance. He declared that the city would one day feed the world.